Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome to what is going to be our second video, or our second lesson in the unit on short stories for 10th grade English. And last time we read from the dystopian short story Harrison Bird, drawn by Kurt Vonnegut. Now we're going to move forward into some additionally, somewhat darker material uh, from Edgar Allan Poe, and we're going to read his short story, The Masque of the Red Death. Now, this might be your first introduction to Edgar Allan Poe as a student overall, but just know that he's really like a favorite author that a lot of English teachers like to sample or take samples from to give students just really, really good, strong examples of very, very what would you want to say? Elegant and strong and rich writing styles. So be prepared to see a lot of Edgar Allan Poe, in your years to come. You may have already seen him before. You may have already gotten a sample of him. Usually in ninth grades, we might like give you the Cask of Amontillado or the Telltale Heart, maybe in middle school. But usually it's a little bit. It takes a little while for us to kind of jump into Edgar Allan Poe if you don't do it in ninth grade. So we're going to start today. So same rules as before with our short stories or with whenever we're really looking at anything at all, any other work of literature or any other work of art at all. Let's take a look at the title. Let's take a look at the genre. Let's take a look at the author, et cetera, et cetera. So the Masque of the Red Death. Now, masque, why is it pronounced that way? Why is it written out that way? Well, if you do a little Google search, masque, what is a masque? What does this mean? It is a mask, yes, obviously, as we understood the term, but it's one that is particularly used, as you could see, in a masquerade. Okay, well, what is a masquerade? When is masquerading, a practice that we would use regularly or would expect to see it? That, of course, is usually on Mardi Gras or on an actual, what do you want to call it? A traditional masquerade ball or a masquerade party, which is when, as you could tell, people put on a mask, usually a very elaborate and very illustrious one, and then dance around or engage in the party and move around. Now, you might ask, why? Why do we do that? Well, there's meant to be some kind of a risque sort of behavior with that. Like you can go around, you can flirt with, talk with, make out with, people that you don't totally know who they are, and just enjoy that sort of party, right? The anonymity, or at least the partial anonymity of the party. Okay, so we have that sort of scene or that sort of party being referenced here. So a masquerade or a masque of the Red Death. Now, the term Red Death, now that usually will trigger students' memory of the Black Death, right? The plague that we are very familiar with from the medieval times, killed off like a third of the population, all this kind of stuff. But this one's red. So why? Okay. So now we are, immediately hearkening back to symbolism. Okay, universal symbols. Red. Why red? Well, red, of course, like we said, elicits, especially in this context, a couple different things. So blood, immediately comes forward as a symbol that we are referencing here. Danger, all that kind of stuff. And you might also say, because you have the mention of masquerade, you have the whole idea of lust and love and passions and all that kind of stuff. So all of those meanings, all of those ideas are kind of compacted into just that simple symbol of the Red Death, whatever that is, being present here. So the Masque of the Red Death, whatever that is, all those ideas are packed in and kind of like giving us a preamble, a preview, a kind of foretelling, or a very ominous sort of sense of what this story is going to be about. Now, Edgar Allan Poe. What do we know about Edgar Allan Poe? Edgar Allan Poe is perhaps one of the most famous, I would say definitely in the top 5 most famous American authors. If we are, not too familiar with literature or, artists overall, we might be more inclined to recognize him from his impact on the Baltimore Ravens. So if you're a football fan, you know the Baltimore Ravens. And why are they called the Baltimore Ravens? Well, because they are named after a famous Edgar Allan Poe poem called The Raven. Well, why would they be called that? Well, because Baltimore is where Edgar Allan Poe was from, or famously is associated with. So he has a relatively good impact, a relatively noticeable impact on America. Now, what was he famous for doing? Well, yeah, The Raven is his most famous poem, so he is a poet, but I think he's much more well known for his short stories. He was a really, really prolific short story writer. And that's fine, that's good. And as we could see, in the 1700s to the 1800s, both of those centuries are really when both novels and short stories really started to explode. And we see a lot of short stories really present there. Now, what sort of style does Edgar Allan Poe use, or what kind of genre is he usually associated with? Well, as you can kind of tell by the this mention of the Raven, by the title of this particular short story, he's associated with more Gothic literature. He likes the Gothic. And I like to, if we haven't already, I mean, from ninth grade, you should kind of remember this when we talked about The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. You kind of should already remember a little bit about the Gothic genre. It deals with the macabre. It deals with darker things, things associated with death and decay and darkness and all that kind of stuff. And it usually has some people within it struggling to kind of get through a situation or struggle against some sort of negative force, all this kind of stuff. And of course, if you want a classic example of that, the most famous, I think, Gothic novel, the most iconic Gothic work of literature is Dracula, right? So we have the whole mood of Dracula, the whole presence of that supernatural monster, and people trying to actively, fight against him in this very grand sort of, moody setting. That is a Gothic scene, or that is a Gothic work. And so Edgar Allan Poe likes this. He loves his macabre, dark, death-oriented or death-entranced sort of works. So for example, if you read The Telltale Heart is of course a short story about a murderer going insane after he has murdered somebody. And then you have, or, before and after he had murdered somebody, going more and more insane. The Cask of Amontillado is about a guy murdering another guy. And The Masque of the Red Death, we will see. What is the whole dark premise here? What's the whole dark subject matter here? So that's the title, that's the author, that's the genre. All of that aside, let's take a look. And as we said before, as usual, we have some reading comprehension questions. I believe, let's see. Yeah, we only have like 9 here. So that's not too difficult. So let's jump right into the story. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains, sudden dizziness, and then profound bleeding, or profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, where the pest ban would shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow man. The whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incense of half an hour. Okay, so what is this story about? As you can tell, it is a plague. It is a pestilence that is sweeping over the land. And I think Poe is obviously not being dabbling in nonfiction here. This is fiction, right? So he's imagining this story where instead of the Black Death, or alongside the Black Death, or after the Black Death, there was an even worse pestilence known as the Red Death. And as we could see here, what is this thing characterized? What is this plague like? It is ridiculously what would you want to say, deadly. It is ridiculously spreading throughout the land. It's so difficult to even combat and even survive, because by the time you know that you have it, you got about a half an hour to live, right? And then you're seeping out blood and all this kind of stuff. So that's why they call it the Red Death, because blood is coming off of you and kind of seeping out of you when you are infected by this thing. Okay. Now, I like this line here. The scarlet stains upon the body, the blood coming out of you, especially on the face of the victim, where the pest ban would shut him out from the aid of sympathy of his fellow man. So what we see here is that, of course, when someone is showing the signs of the Red Death, he is shut out from the sympathy and aid of his fellow human beings. Well, why? Because they're afraid. They're afraid of him. He becomes kind of like a leper, right? So that idea is right off the bat kind of introduced to us by Poe. This idea that not only is it terrible that this plague is spreading through the world or whatever country we are in, but the country rather, yeah, that we are in. But when you get it, it kind of enforces this, or not enforces, but it really strongly incentivizes unsympathetic and antisocial behavior, right? And we, of course, are very familiar with this if we lived through COVID-19, right? We understand that, yes, that's kind of how infectious, plagues and pestilences can make us behave. So that's what's spreading through the land. Fine, fine, fine. Let's take a look at our main character. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep secluse of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it. The walls had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers, and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned with such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All of these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. Okay, so what we see here is this guy, Prince Prospero, a prince, and talk about the name in a minute, who decides after the people in his realm have decreased their population by 50%, right? Half of them are dead from the Red Death. He decides to lock himself in, to effectively quarantine himself inside this castled abbey with all of his courtiers, with all of his friends, basically. We can kind of assume that these are the people that could afford to be there in there, the people that knew him, so the upper class, right? So we have here some really toxic sort of classist behavior where he and his upper class friends lock themselves in to this abbey, this castled abbey, and lock everybody else out. And he just pours on the pleasures from within, okay? Now, a couple different things that you see going on there. We see, if you remember from earlier in class, us discussing this idea of the metaphors of life. So we see a typical metaphor there where we try to create a walled and structured safe space to keep the unknown or the chaotic or the dangerous things out, and we try to keep everything safe within. Fine, that's okay, but remember the conflict of that metaphor, of stories that evoke that metaphor. The conflict is going to be, number one, with the anxiety and the stress of keeping whatever was out, and that there is a serious danger of some kind of corruption or some kind of moral or psychological weakness affecting you by keeping yourself in that enclosed, safe space forever. So let's keep that in mind. So, okay, so Prince Prospero, number 3, or paragraph 3. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. Okay, so inside his quarantine, he's got 1,000 friends, which, some of us might think, that's not a really good quarantine if you had 1,000 people. Like, that's I would imagine the plague might find its way in at that point, but whatever. So he has this masquerade, which, pause. Look at the irreverence of this. Look at the lack of sympathy that Prospero has for his countrymen, right? One of the misunderstandings that people have about the mentality of the rich or the upper class, and this is I'm thinking of like the English aristocracy here, is that they simply had no responsibility to those below them. This is absolutely not true. As any like really hardcore, British imperialist will tell you, no. the proper role of the aristocracy is to care for, is to try to help shepherd and heal or aid in any way the lower class. Not to the degree, of course, where they become the new upper class, but to try to really be a good leader and shepherd of your people, like a king. And of course, Prospero's not doing that. Now, there's irony in his name, of course, because his name literally means the prosperous one. So he is prosperous, right? At least materially. He's got all of his friends around him. He's got all this kind of like, orgiastic, party stuff going on around him. And yet there's a deep level of dysfunction to what he's doing because he's shutting everyone out. Now, we might ask, why is he doing this? Well, obviously, he's doing it because he does not want to die. He does not want to become subject to an untimely death. Keep that in mind. Next paragraph, long one. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many places, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue or of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, a vividly blue were its windows, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple, and its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished with lightened with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon the carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum. Amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, or depended from the roof, there was no light of any kind emanating from the lamp or candle from within the suites of the chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood opposite to each window a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that protected its rays, throughout the tinted glass, and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings throughout the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. Okay, so we have this layout of the masquerade rooms, right? And we have, of course, the 7 rooms, right? Each of which is associated with a different color. I'm not going to go through each color. We do that more in depth in class, but you can very clearly, I think, see, and the majority of people who analyze this story very clearly can pick up the heavy-handed symbolism that Poe is laying down, that each room corresponds with some level or some phase of one's life. And of course, what kind of gives that away is this idea that the last one is black, and it has red light all over it, very clearly referencing the Black Death, or the Red Death in this case, right? And the blackness of death itself. Okay, so the masquerade's going on during the pandemic, during this, this horrible plague. Prospero's hanging out, having a party. And by the way, some people have pointed out that it's kind of a weirdly irreverent also that he's doing this inside of an abbey, that he's, closeting himself inside of an abbey, which is a symbol of religion, which is a symbol of Christian religion, which is deeply characterized by its care for the poor. So there is a deep level of moral irony in what he's doing here, okay? And it's kind of gross at some level. Okay, let's take a look. It was in this apartment also, that is the black one, that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand had made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that, at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused revere or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock would produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulous and meditation as before. Okay, so inside that last room, there's a clock. Every hour, what the clock do? It chimes, and when it chimes, everyone sort of freezes and looks very, very serious and solemn and downcast. What is this symbolic of? This is what we would call in Latin a memento mori, which is a remembrance of your mortality, a remembrance, a reminder that you are going to die, that your time is running out. Time is going second by second by second towards our inevitable death, okay? And these people, when they are confronted with that, freeze, which demonstrates to us, guys and gals, that they are practicing some really elaborate, what we would call thanatophobia. And what does that mean exactly? It means the pathological fear of death. They are living in a culture and a society of their own creation, I would say, that is paranoid and afraid of death, okay? Fascinating subject that Edgar Allan Poe is raising here. The inevitability of death and our reactions to it. Many people, and apparently Poe is really poking at the rich and poking at the upper class, the privileged among us, try to evade or ignore or at least kind of put away from our consciousness for a time the reality of death, which, like we said, is inevitable. And this is futile. This is pathetic. This is absurd, because there are very few things in this world that are more evident to us than death. And I think what Poe is obviously doing is kind of inviting his audience to partake in some aspect of this and think, how would you react to such a situation? How do we behave, both our culture and ourselves, to that inevitable call from death, that it's going to happen and that is eventually coming towards us? Do we react with fear and kind of like constant, neurotic, fleeing from it, which, by the way, is completely futile, do we suppress it in our psychological weakness and don't want to think about it at all? Or do we, have another aspect to it, a more healthy approach to it? This is kind of what we're seeing confronted here. Okay, let's move on. Because we only have, I think, by the way, this is a really relatively short story, even though, as you could see, Edgar Allan Poe's diction, his word choice here is very, very elevated. It's one of the things that really turns students off of Edgar Allan Poe. And it's pretty characteristic of anybody who's writing in the 1800s, by the way, is they have a really, really strong command of the English language. Which is why I encourage you, usually in my class, I put a link to this, or I put another audio book link to this. Go listen to that. There are some really, really strong readers of this particular work, and a lot of Poe's work, which just read it beautifully, and it just sounds so much better than me. So go check that out and listen to it in its full power. Next paragraph. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye of colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure he was not. Okay, so Prospero has quite a crazy taste, right? He's very much on the cutting edge of fashion. He's very much of an artist, right? I think of New Yorkers. I think of New York City people, upper class, when I see this kind of stuff. But, that's just me. He had directed, in great part, a movable embellishments of the seven chambers upon the occasion of this great feat, and it was his own guiding taste, which had given character to the masqueraders. But I'm sorry, be sure they were grotesque. There was much glare and glitter in piquancy, and phantasm, much of which had been seen since the Hernani. There were, there were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of of that which might be excited disgust. To and fro in the seven chambers were stalked, there stalked, in fact, multitude of dreams. And these dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then, for a moment, all is still, all is still, all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams were stiff frozen as the sand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemn and emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in more remote gaieties of the other apartments. So the dreamers, right? The dreams, the metaphor, obviously, for the people who are kind of dancing throughout the halls, are stopped again by the clock when it chimes. And notice this, two other pieces of information here. The clock and the apartment of Black are in the most westward part of the wing. Why west? Because the sun sets in the west. And of course, we were just told the night is dying away. The day is dying away. I'm using the term dying on purpose, right? The time of day is symbolic of our lives, of death itself. Okay, the sun setting, night falling, death coming, are the end approaching. Same thing with the directions of the sun, right? It rises in the east. East is a symbol of new birth. The west is a symbol of death, basically, or a symbol of passing into the next life. Okay, now what? But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat fervishly the heart of life. And the revel went wearingly on, until at length there commenced a sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock. And thus it happened, perhaps, that more of a thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz, a murmur, expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror and disgust. So midnight comes, 12 chimes, right? Midnight, end of the day, 12 chimes, dead of night. What happens? There's a new person that's at least noticed, apparently, in the assembly. Who is it? We're not sure. But his or her presence elicits no positive reaction. In an assembly of phantasms, much as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out Heroded Herod, had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests. There are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company indeed seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny might have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all of this might have been endured, if not approved by the mad revelers around. But the murmur had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vestures his vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. So this figure appears. We get the description of him. He's tall, right? We think like 6 foot, 7 foot tall, gaunt, which means like bone thin. And he's covered in the habiliments of the grave, which means he's like wearing rags that you bury people in. And his mask, if it is a mask, by the way, because it's hard to tell, looks like a corpse, which like, wow, good costume, man. And it's covered in blood, or it looks like it's covered in blood. So this isn't, as is usually described, like just some kind of cloaked figure. No, this is like, looks like some guy that just walked out of a bloody grave, okay? And everyone is looking at this and thinking like, that's messed up, in this really eccentric kind of like almost perverse party. And they're like, that's too much, that's messed up, which is interesting, right? It's interesting that these people who are profane, are bizarre and disgusting in their tastes and their revelry, they're okay, they will be fine with all of that, but they're not okay with the presence of someone who mimics death. That they will not allow. Can't joke about that. Interesting. Okay, again with the thanatophobia. So what happens? When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder of either terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. Okay, who dares, he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements. Okay, so he's freaking out at this guy, wants to hang him. Okay. It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hands. So notice he's in the blue room. He's in the first room, probably symbolically referencing how Prospero is a man-child, is someone who has no real maturity about him. He has not yet confronted the reality of death. In other words, the reality of reality. He has not actually looked at anything in the world, which again goes back to our metaphors, right? He's enclosed himself in this protected little garden, this protected little place of his life. He's never had to deal with anything outside. Okay, well, how's that going to go for him? Let's take a look. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker, but from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the murmur had inspired the whole party. The mummer, I should say, the mummer had inspired the whole party. There was found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn, measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a dissident movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon them all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sabled carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment and seized the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they had handled with so violent rudeness, unattended by any tangible form. Okay, so what happens? The mummer, right, the Red Death figure, goes to Prince Prospero and then walks down the halls towards that black room. Prospero tries to run after him and is going to stab him with a dagger. Very symbolic, obviously, of him wanting to what? Conquer death. He tries to stab it. He tries to remove it. In doing so, what happens? Figure turns around as soon as he does and faces Prospero. Prospero just drops stone dead. And then everyone does what? They try to seize the guy and do what with him? We don't know. And that image right there is very haunting, right? They're all seizing at death. Unknowingly of really who he is and what he is doing, right? You can kind of, again, read that symbolically. Like they're trying to, like Prospero, stop death. They're trying to control death. When ironically, in doing so, what are you really doing? Like Prospero, you are just running closer to it. You're making that process quicker, right? And that's kind of the idea, same thing of like that sheltered idea. The more you try to shelter yourself from the dangers of the world, the more you make yourself victims of it. It's a very deep and abiding idea and theme in literature throughout the world. Okay, so they grab him, and then what happens? Intangible, right? There's nothing there, which again, symbolic, ironic, horrifying, by the way. They try to grab it. This attempt to grab onto something to control death just is made fruitless, is made futile. So the figure falls, and it's like, it doesn't Obi-Wan Kenobi where it just like disappears. There's nothing but rags, right? And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. So first, now the Red Death is there. Its presence was acknowledged, the presence of the Red Death. So are they all dying of this plague? I think so. I think so. I think that's clearly what the figure was meant to be, is a kind of personification, right? A literal mystical personification of death and the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night. So again, kind of this idea of like the serpent who gets into the garden, right? The danger that inevitably does get into your protected space. He comes in, and one by one, everyone drops and dies in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired. So clock stops as our last person dies, the lights go out, and we get the final line. And darkness and decay. Notice capital D. So like the concept of darkness and the concept of death, or sorry, decay, and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. It's a great final line. So darkness, decay, and you might as well just say death holds illimitable dominion over all. Showing what, guys? The power of death, the power of mortality. We can't overcome it. We can't stop it, no matter what we do to try to delude ourselves. Okay. So that's Edgar Allan Poe for you. That's the Masque of the Red Death. Now, let's take a quick look at a couple things here. So, what affliction is present in the setting of the story? The Red Death. Okay, this plague, the Red Death, more deadly, way more deadly than the Black Death. Describe the characterization of Prince Prospero in the second paragraph, right? He's eccentric, right? He's kind of, well, not only the eccentric, but he's trying to close himself off. So he has this interesting, what do you want to call it? Delusion, like self-delusion in himself. He really isolates himself from the world. He really utilizes his privilege in a very toxic sort of way. What type of party does he throw? It is what is the potential significance of it? The masquerade, right? I mean, like we talked about how it's irreverent, it's kind of grotesque, it's kind of like a celebration of the excesses of life. But the significance of it also, like you could say it is a mask, right? You are masking yourself. You are putting a mask or putting up a persona is a word that we could use. Is what that's called, right? A persona is basically a mask. That makes it seem like you don't care about what's going on. When we could all acknowledge, guys and gals, that Prospero and his company do in fact know that the Red Death is there, and that therefore death is there, but they're choosing to ignore it. They're choosing to put on a mask and pretend that it's not there. That's kind of what's going on here. Number 4, what colors are associated with the rooms and what might their significance be? We talked about this, of course, as they are significant of the different stages of life. I'm not going to go through in detail, but we could, go look that up. There's a lot of people who analyze that kind of stuff. It's really kind of interesting why Poe chooses which colors he does. 5, what object lies in the final apartment? What effect does this have on the partiers? Of course, that's the clock, right? That's their memento mori. Number 6, describe the new figure that appears and the effect he has on the party. Well, figure, right? It's a figure that is a mummer. It's described as a mummer, like a mummy, as a figure from the grave, as a figure kind of representing someone who has died from the Red Death, right? So is this Death himself? Is this the Red Death? Is this kind of the angel of death? Is it taking to someone taking the form of someone who has died from the Red Death? We don't know. It's something mystical and haunting, right? It's really typical Edgar Allan Poe stuff where it's just spooky, you know? Number 7, how does Prospero react to this figure? With horror and disgust, and then with rage, right? He really does not like the presence of this thing, which we talked about. Like, why it's so ironic that, you know, you're so hyper, you know, I could use the word liberal and promiscuous with your tastes, but you don't allow this, right? Something that's truly real. And, you know, you might experience this the more old you get. I certainly have experienced this. I've known people who you know, put on that worldly facade, put on this very serious and worldly facade, and like they're very, you know, arrogant, and they're very kind of like, you know, boastful of how strong or how intelligent they feel. But there are some subjects that when you bring them up, they shrink back from them and they become very, very uncomfortable. And death is certainly one of those subjects, right? Especially among the powerful and the arrogant among us. Death really does make people uncomfortable, not merely because it is like that kind of finality and that kind of like unknown aspect that what we're going to have is going to be lost. Obviously, that's bad. But I think to people like that, people like who are arrogant and very much like Prospero, it's a sign that they are not in charge, that you do not have complete dominion over your life. Your life is in someone or something else's hands. And even if you want to be blunt about it, that's just death, right? Death has control over you. You don't have control over your own life in many regards, okay? Or at least in that regard. What is the mood of the story's conclusion? My God, it is depressing, right? It is solemn. It is like, oh, it's like macabre. You know, it's very like, wow, it really just like fixates on that reality of death. Now, Edgar Allan Poe, again, comes from a Christian tradition, comes from a spiritual tradition, and he is himself relatively spiritual, but I love the fact that he doesn't really bring any of that into the story. He just like wants to take a moment and say, no, let's acknowledge and give death its due, and just look at how awful it can be and how scary it can be, okay? So, finally, number 9, what are the possible themes that Poe is articulating through this story? Well, there's a couple. Number 1 is, yes, the danger of sheltering yourself in, the danger in trying to lock all of reality out, the danger in trying to mask yourself from reality, the danger in not confronting reality, and of course, the inevitability and the overwhelming power of death over human life, right? And the danger of denying that reality, I think, is a huge point here. You could also go a little bit deeper and say maybe there's a poke at the society here. Maybe there's a poke at upper class society, aristocratic society. That's a possibility. So there's a lot of ideas you could pull out from Edgar Allan Poe. So that's The Masque of the Red Death. Hope you enjoyed it, as dark as it may be. The next thing we're going to go into is a little bit less dark, but still a little bit depressing and kind of moody. And that is a very rich, but also kind of confusing short story called The Bet by Anton Chekhov. So that is what we'll be doing next time. Thanks very, very much and have a wonderful day. I will see you soon.